Good evening, everyone. I am Priya Farate, and on behalf of today's volunteers and the Santa Clara Valley chapter of CNPS, I welcome you all to tonight's program. We will start the program by reading the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the work done by the Santa Clara Valley chapter of CNPS lies in the homeland of the Ama Mutsun tribal band, the Thamian Nation, the Ramaitush Oloni, and the Muwekma Oloni, who still live and thrive in this area today. We hope to learn from them and support their work to restore traditional practices and heal from historical trauma. This is the team bringing you the program tonight. I am your host, Priya. Your greeters and volunteers, some of whom you might have met, are Paul, Shelky, Deborah, Amy, and Vicky. Last but not the least is our speaker, Stephanie Morris. For those who are new to CNPS, we are a nonprofit organization founded in 1965. We have over 13,000 members in 35 chapters spread all over California and Baja California. The Santa Clara Valley chapter, of whom we are a part of, covers Santa Clara and southern San Mateo counties. The mission of CNPS is to protect California's native plants and their natural habitats through science, education, stewardship, gardening, and advocacy. If you're not already a member, we welcome you to join us and support our work. By planting native plants, not only are you protecting California's natural diversity, but you're also creating a wonderful habitat for our wildlife. Some of the membership benefits include Artemisia, the Journal of the California Native Plant Society. This is published twice a year and it contains a lot of scientific articles. Flora is published quarterly, and each issue includes inspiring interviews, conservation updates, native gardening advice, and beautiful photos. You will also receive the Blazing Star, which is our chapter's newsletter. This has everything that you need to know about the chapter and the upcoming activities we have and how you can volunteer or participate in those. You can join by going to cnps.com/join, or you can scan the QR code at the bottom of the screen. With all that's happening, I'm sure you want to stay in touch with the chapter. If you're not already on the weekly email list, I highly recommend that you join it because that way you will get a weekly reminder of what is coming up on the following week, the latest information about events, and announcements about activities. Finally, for tonight's program, our speaker is Stephanie Morris. Stephanie has been designing California native plant gardens since 1999 in the Bay Area. Her goal is to design creative, beautiful landscapes that are ecologically oriented and practical. Areas of particular focus include suggesting plants for pollinators, converting lawns to drought tolerant plants, incorporating California native plants within existing gardens, and combining edible plants with native plant gardens. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Priya. I will go ahead and share the presentation. Okay, are you seeing the presentation?
Yes, it's all good.
Fantastic. So thank you everybody for joining this talk. I'm very excited to share with you part 3 of a 3-part series that I've put together. The talk tonight is all about maintaining a native plant garden. And I would like to thank Priya very much for hosting this talk and also thank the Cupertino Library for hosting this talk as well. So as I mentioned, this is part 3 of a talk. Parts 1 and 2 are also recorded on YouTube. Part 1 was design basics and plant selection, and part 2 is planting and installation, if you'd like to do it yourself. and part 3 is maintenance. I had several folks contribute to this talk and help me over the years. So I would like to thank Patricia Evans and Lior Dahan, Madeline Morrow, Aggie Kehoe, Sherry Osaka, and Lori Palmquist, who provided information and some pictures. And this talk was in part derived from a panel that Patricia, Lior, Madeline, and I did with CNPS a few years ago now, and that talk is also recorded. So the topics we will discuss tonight are first some maintenance basics, then pruning and lots of different examples of plants and pruning, some control of weeds and how to schedule water and irrigation, and then at last wrap it up with some of my favorite tools for maintenance. So first, to dive right into maintenance basics. First of all gardens do need some maintenance. And the way to think about it is to first start asking yourself some big picture questions. How much time do you wish to spend on the garden? Do you like to garden yourself? Would you rather pay somebody else to help you maintain it? But all gardens will need some maintenance. Even the most low maintenance plants will still need some weeding and some cleanup. So we basically equate what our maintenance goals are with what we are willing to do or what we're willing to pay somebody to do. And in a low maintenance garden, we want to minimize debris of plants, minimize our water use and our time. So the basic kind of overall schedule that I tend to think about when I maintain my own native garden is that in late winter and early spring, I'm doing a lot of weeding. That's the primary season for weeding. And then in fall and early winter, I'm doing some pruning and some mulching and getting ready for the rainy season. And then in summer, I'm doing some time of just rest and letting the garden rest as well. And then some occasional flower trimming and pruning, especially kind of toward the end of the summer. I wanted to share a little bit about a case study that was done. This was a 6-year study in Santa Monica, and it's called Garden Garden. You can find it online by searching up Garden Garden, Santa Monica. They did a side-by-side comparison of 2 different homes, a traditional garden with lawn on the left side and a native garden on the right side, and they tracked it. And then over the 6 years, they found that there was $2,200 less in annual maintenance, and it saved 77% less water. So I thought that was a very interesting study. There's statistics on this website as well with yard waste and debris and other aspects of the garden. The one thing that I really like about native plant gardening is that native gardens are much more flexible when you do the maintenance. So rather than a lawn where you have to mow it every week or two, otherwise it starts looking very long and shaggy and starts to get yellow when you mow it too late, native gardens can be pruned this month or next month. There's really a lot of time flexibility in there. So that's really nice for busy people. If you feel like working on your garden one weekend, you can. If you feel like deferring it for another week or two, that's also just fine. The one thing I've also had clients tell me over the years is that if they have been paying somebody to mow their garden and clean up, and then they transition to a native garden and they start doing their own maintenance, it actually feels like they're doing more maintenance because they've decided to take that on themselves. So that's something to keep in mind if you're transitioning to more of a traditional landscape versus a do-it-yourself native plant garden landscape. If you do hire out for maintenance, make sure to look for fine gardeners or a landscape company that really knows how to properly prune or is willing to learn. And a bonus is if they are willing to help you check your watering system and check for adequate moisture to the plants over time. One thing I like to stress is that good design actually does equal less maintenance. And this is because every plant really wants to grow to a set of characteristics. So it has a certain genetic destiny for its height and its width. It has its certain water or sun needs based on where it grows in nature or where it was selected from. So we can only fight genetic destiny so much. And if we put the right plant in the right place in the beginning and we allow it to grow to the size that it wants to be, we can avoid a lot of extra pruning and a lot of extra work. And we can tinker with that a little bit, but when we try to make a wide plant narrow or place plants really close together and we're constantly pruning them, then we just have a lot of extra work and things don't flower properly and they're just not as healthy as they could otherwise be. So a lot of times we are very concerned about taking a plant out or killing a plant. But in an established garden, it's actually good maintenance to kind of assess and see whether things are functioning the way they should. And sometimes, if we have high water plants next to low water plants or things that are just not healthy, replacing them actually can be better than trying to keep them in place. And when we do native plant design, there are ways we can think about less maintenance and less pruning with the plants we choose, because California has thousands of native plant species, and some of them do better with deadheading, and others of them don't. So this slide has two different varieties, two species, Arctostaphylos, the manzanita, and then Ceanothus, the California lilac. And the lilac's the one with the blue flowers, and the manzanita is the one here in the middle on the bottom, and on the right with the pink flowers. And both of these species do not need deadheading. When the flowers are finished blooming, they just fall off the plant, and the plant just keeps growing. And their pruning for structural shaping is needed maybe only every few years, sometimes even a little bit less. So they have a lot less green waste, and therefore are a lot easier to maintain in the landscape. And they're also both evergreen too, which is fantastic. I'm going to talk about pruning. First, I'll talk about some general pruning strategies, and then give you kind of a plant by plant list of different types of pruning for each plant. So the basics of why we would prune. First, we want to look at what part of the plant might be diseased or just have dead wood or dead leaves, dead branches. That's sort of the first order of business with pruning. Then we might look at just how we can kind of clean it up and make it look tidier overall. We also might deadhead any flowers that have finished blooming, which means to cut those flowers off. Whenever we prune, we stimulate new, more compact growth and a sturdier plant. So rather than thinking solely of pruning as cutting away a plant, it's actually encouraging plants to grow. And so we think about how it's going to grow when we prune it. And then to some extent, we can adjust the size, taller, wider, within reason, of course, not fighting its genetic destiny too much. And in another reason we may prune is for fire resilience. So we can prune out the dead portions of the plant. We can open up the plant a little bit to make it a little bit more airy, to make sure that's a little bit less dense and maybe has less debris in it to keep it more fire resilient. Here is a general idea of when to prune most things. So evergreens, we would typically prune those in late summer to early fall, and we would prune those when it is warm and dry outside. And this is so that the cuts we make on the pruning can heal and avoid fungus from the water being damp and coming into those pruning cuts. We also want to make sure we prune evergreen plants after the flowering and after any berries, so that we're not cutting off future flowers or cutting off future berries. For a deciduous plant that loses its leaves in the winter, we generally would prune those in winter when they are dormant. But there are some exceptions. You can prune some of those in the summer a little bit to do some thinning of that plant, to do some pinching of it, to bring it back a little bit. So sometimes there's a little bit of summer pruning, but a lot of winter pruning. For one thing, it's a lot easier to see the branching structure in the winter when there aren't any leaves on the plant. And a couple pruning tips: we would avoid pruning right before a hard frost, avoid pruning right before it's going to rain to give the cuts time to heal. And I guess one other thing could be mentioned is try to avoid pruning when it's extraordinarily hot as well. Perennials and semi-woody plants are okay to summer deadhead. You can cut back the flowers on those, and then you can prune back the whole plant, usually to about a third of its size, sometimes a little bit more, up to a half or maybe even slightly more depending on the species. You'd prune those back in late summer to fall. And some plants are very forgiving about whether you deadhead, and some plants do look better if they're deadheaded during the summer. This picture on the right shows what my second box here is illustrating, which is that the plant will often show you that it's ready to be pruned back by pushing new evergreen growth inside of the plant. And you can see the old stalks coming out here and the new green growth coming from the middle. And when you see that visible growth or even the little buds starting to form or little small leaves, then it's a clue that it's okay to prune those longer stems back into this newer green growth and let this new green growth take over. Different ways to prune for maximum flowers. So in general, pruning about 4 to 6 months before next blooming season is a good rule of thumb. That allows you to prune the plant back, keep it compact, but not cut off the future flowers. So many spring and summer flowering perennials are pruned in late summer or fall, so like October through December, kind of at the very end of our summer into the fall. Plants that bloom in the winter, such as manzanita and silk tassel, are pruned in the summer, so usually July and August. How to make the pruning cut. So when you're making cuts with your shears, always make sure to cut right above a leaf node. So in this picture, you can see my shears are right above this little gray batch of leaves. And when you make those cuts, the direction that those new leaves or buds are growing is the direction that your branch will start to sprout. So you can control a plant's growth somewhat, pruning so that buds are facing outward if you want it to grow more outward, so that buds are facing inward if you want it to grow more inward, and it will grow in that direction. And in general, the sort of rule of thumb is that you want the plant to kind of gently grow outward. There's very few times you want it to completely grow inward unless you're really trying to get it to fill in and be a little bit more compact. So deadheading, as I mentioned, is removing a flower that is finished blooming, and here is an example of that. You will trim that flower stalk all the way down to the leaves and either cut it right before the top little ring of leaves or area of leaves, or cut a little bit of leaf off but leave some new leaves below it. If you leave these little stubs of branch sticking up after you deadhead, they will not reflower again on most species. They'll just stick up looking like little brown stubs everywhere. So we want to make sure that we trim all those off so the plant looks nice and tidy afterward. And then keep in mind that in some cases it's actually a good idea to leave some flowers on longer so that they can be used by birds. So this picture shows some of the flowers are pink and still in bloom. Some of them are kind of fading to light pink, and then some of them have gone kind of a russet brown, and those are the finished flowers and the seed heads, and the birds will use those. So it's kind of okay to be a little bit lazy, because then the birds have something to eat, and then we can prune them all back later when everything is finished blooming in the fall. If you have a larger structural cut because you need to take off a side branch or otherwise adjust the growth of something, prune that branch all the way back to the trunk if you can, if it makes sense structurally, or to a leaf node. And usually there's kind of a rule of thumb that you want to make sure that if you've got a smaller branch, a medium branch, and a large branch, you don't leave a stub of a pretty large branch sticking out. It just doesn't end up looking very good. So you kind of want to prune back into smaller branches and keep gradually pruning versus cut into lots of big, thick stubs. And when you do cut a thicker branch, try to cut it back a little bit further in most cases, for most species. This is about pinching. So pinching is basically just taking off a little bit of the bud on the end of a branch, and this can keep something looking more bushy. This is especially good for evergreen shrubs. And of course, we avoid pinching right before something is going to start flowering or budding, because then we're going to be cutting off the flowers. A little bit more about not leaving branch stubs. So here is a manzanita that I actually did prune, and it should have been pruned all the way back. So this branch that's kind of growing horizontally in the picture that looks a little bit grayish is a branch that was left on, and it is now died back. So once you leave it like that, it's not going to grow back and make new little leaves and branches. This is especially true of the tree manzanitas. Once you prune the leaves and kind of open them up, they don't usually push new leaves in the middle. Some plant species will do that, but manzanita trees usually do not. And in this case, the reason why I did this, which is not, a pruning error, is because it structurally looked so much better with this branch that I couldn't bear to cut it off. And so I needed it to keep it on there a little longer until the bush kind of otherwise filled out and then cut it off. I wouldn't recommend doing it that way, but it does make a good demonstration of what not to do. So I'm sharing it with you. So here's an example of the tall manzanita, how to prune that to open it up a little bit. You would be pruning this in the dry months in the summer and removing the dead or crossing branches first. You can see in this picture down in the bottom middle, some of the branches have turned kind of like a grayish or lighter color, and usually those are the signifying as dead branches. You can also very easily tell a dead branch versus a not dead branch because they're very brittle when they start to die on most every type of plant, in addition to that color change. So I would first go in, trim out any dead branches, diseased branches, allow some more light to enter into the plant, and then I just look for how to make it structurally interesting, to keep the branches that are the most dominant, that have the nicest shape, and then prune out some of the ones that are smaller or that crisscross in the middle or just don't look as good for that particular plant. Manzanita, this one on the right is kind of a really nicely shaped upright one, but they will often grow more horizontal and have just really quirky, interesting shapes that are fun to prune and honor. The lower growing manzanitas, the shrub varieties and low ground cover varieties especially, you can also prune those in the dry months and prune to keep them a little bit more compact. Same thing, kind of prune back to a major branch or a bud. In this case, you can see in the the left-hand picture that it was overgrowing a sidewalk. So I just kind of gently pinched back with my shears, clipped back a little bit of each part of the branch. And try not to make it into a straight line. Try to kind of give it some branches cut back a little further, some cut back a little bit forward to give it a sense of natural edge. The ceanothus or California lilacs in general also need very little pruning. So it's one of our lowest maintenance evergreen shrubs. And there are various types of California lilac from ground cover all the way to tree. For the tree species, it's the same sort of process. You'd clean out the dead or diseased. You can open up the lower portion as it ages, either into a multi-trunk or a single trunk tree. And that's really all they generally need. They're not very particular and don't want a lot of hard pruning. So doing the minimal is best for these, and doing it gradually over the years is ideal. And I think that probably goes for most plants, that doing something kind of gradually versus letting it grow and then whacking it down is in general a better approach. So gradual shaping. This is the ground cover type of ceanothus, one of many. This one's called Yankee Point. If it's pruned like this in the picture, once or twice a year, you can keep it as low as 10 to 12 inches high. And if it's not pruned at all, it can really mound up. It can get to about 3 feet high or even a little bit more. And the same thing happens if it's pruned on the sides and not pruned on the top. It will tend to just kind of billow up and grow fairly tall on the top. All the ceanothus are fairly quick growers in general. They're faster on the whole than the manzanitas. So especially these ground cover ones do need at least a little bit more management if you want to keep it nice and tidy and reasonably low like this. But they are well worth it, and it's probably about once or twice a year that you would do the pruning. So it's not overly burdensome. And they flower in the spring. I'm not going to talk extensively about oaks, but I thought I would mention that they are also pruned in dry weather, summer to early fall. And if you have a large oak tree or a small one in need of structural pruning, it's best to consult with an arborist who has a specialty in oaks. And we do have some of those arborists listed on our chapter website, cnps-scv for Santa Clara Valley.org. And you can search under, I believe it's a resources tab, and you'll find a list of native plant professionals, and there are arborists on that list. I will talk a little bit about bush anemone here and a little bit more later in the talk. This plant is a very flexible plant that can take a fair amount of pruning, and it can also be left unpruned as well. If you prune it, make sure to prune it after flowering, so that would be late summer. You can see in this picture on the left, Its flowers are completely finished, they've turned kind of brown, and it tends to get these yellow leaves on its inner portions, so kind of closer to the branches on the trunk. And oftentimes I'll let this one grow for a few years, and then if I want to kind of pinch it back or thin it out a little bit, that's when I'll do a little bit more pruning. And you can see in the middle picture, I'm trimming off some finished flowers. And in the right hand picture is much more of a thorough pruning. And what I've done in this one is I've taken out some of the old canes that grow straight up because they've gotten woody and they're not really producing as good of a leaf quality because they're not getting much light anymore. And this one's kind of in a narrow bed against a wall, so I wanted it to be kind of narrow, almost like an espalier or a flat shrub without wires or armature. And so I thinned it out a lot by cutting those canes that were older all the way to the ground. And then it will come back, fill in, and bloom again the next spring. It's not necessary to prune it this much, but it can be pruned quite thoroughly if it's mature and it has a good root structure. Coppicing is also okay for the bush anemone, and coppicing means to cut a plant to the ground to rejuvenate it. And I will show later several other species that can be managed this way if need be. The coffeeberry is another fantastic native plant for gardens. It tends to be very, very low maintenance because it keeps a nice shape almost without much pruning at all. It tends to grow lots of nice leaves kind of in a more symmetrical shape, and it doesn't really need pruning other than to just shape it or remove dead wood. So it's very minimal on the pruning. If you do prune it after it berries and before it flowers so that you're not cutting off either of those. Here is the holly-leaf cherry. This is also an evergreen plant and can be pruned back fairly vigorously. It does start to grow faster as it ages. It can be sometimes a little slow when you first plant it, but then once it really gets its roots going, it can start to grow a little faster. It makes a fantastic evergreen screen if you want to have a little bit more privacy, a big privacy hedge. It can grow 12 to 15 feet or even taller. And I typically recommend pruning this one after the berries. And so that would be kind of like a late summer into the fall time period. And the picture on the middle is what it was looking like. It had some branches that were kind of growing straight out into a walkway. And the picture on the right is what it looked like after it was pruned back to give it more of it's not hedged because it's very still a natural pruning, but it does make more of a dense screen. It's kind of like a natural hedge. And then the picture on the left shows, probably a little hard to tell, my shears and where I was pruning. So I'm always pruning back to a branch where it's dividing or to a node where it's going to re-leaf out. There are some evergreens that we do not want to prune in fall. So Ceanothus, California lilac, we can pinch these in spring after the bloom or thin them in the summer. The toyon, we do not want to prune it in fall because it's going to be cutting off its berries. So we would just prune that later in winter. And exceptions to these plants would be if you're going to do some structural shaping and kind of cut full branches back to shape it, you can go ahead and do that, but not pinching type pruning. Same thing with the silk tassel because it blooms in winter, and same thing with the manzanita. So we don't want to cut the future flowers off. The coyote bush is also a very interesting plant. It can be pruned by cutting it to the ground. And when I grew this one in my front yard, that is what I ended up doing because I would let it grow out for about 3 years, sometimes 4, and they would start to get quite large. It's sort of a mounding ground cover, but it would start to mound up 3-4 feet tall. And then as I tried to trim it back or pinch it, you would see what I'm showing on this upper right, where there's all this dead branches and dead thatch, and then the green is on top. So when you try to prune it, you sort of just prune down into this dead network of branches. And so I ended up coppicing mine all the way to the ground, which made it look a little bit twiggy at first, but it comes back quite quickly. And it was a good opportunity to replenish my mulch at the same time and just kind of lower the risk of fire from that particular plant, because although it looks very green in the before picture, you can see that there's all this dry matter underneath. I think another way to manage this plant, if you were a little more proactive and a little less busy than I, would be to possibly do a little bit of tip pruning every year to just kind of keep it down to size. But the coppicing works really well. And this picture next shows what it looks like when you do that in succession. So you don't have to do them all at the same time. You don't have to necessarily have a bare landscape for a time. So on the left, I did not prune one. And on the one on the right, I went ahead and had cut that back, and now it's the next spring and it's completely grown back in. And then the picture on the right was one of the years where I did cut them all the way back, and then they all came in and filled in. So it's a very, very flexible plant. I actually had a client who decided to coppice these in the middle of summer in the heat, and I was horrified for him. I thought they would not make it, but they actually did just fine. He may or may not have watered them afterward to spur on a little growth, which can sometimes be helpful. This is a list of natives that are okay to coppice. This is assuming that they have been established and do have some roots already growing. Otherwise, if they didn't have roots and you coppiced them, you would probably kill it. So anything that's probably 3 years old or older can be considered established and could be coppiced. So the coyote bush I mentioned, the bush anemone, redbuds you can also coppice. You can trim down branches to the ground. If you have too many trunks, you can cut more than a few if you need to. Dogwoods, toyons, I've had to coppice sometimes because I would have a lot of leaf disease on them. And then typically when I coppice it, they come back and they're a lot healthier. I think the exception to that would be a very, like a single trunk tree or a tree that has a really nice branch structure to it. Of course, you're going to totally destroy that branch structure. So for a little multi-trunk toyon, it probably would be a more successful choice than something that already had a really nice structure. Mock orange, because it also sends up many, many little branches, is great for coppicing. Elderberry, because it sends up tons of little branches and is a very, very vigorous grower. And snowberry, and then also island snapdragon you can cut down very low. Here's an example of some elderberry trees, different ones, and you can see that they send up all these multiple trunks, and they definitely do need annual pruning. They get a lot bigger than the books and resources say that they do. And I found when I had an elderberry, it was pretty much fine no matter what season I planted it in. They do take a brief rest in the winter for a month or so in our area, and they do go deciduous, but they can be pruned almost any time. And their growth is particularly vigorous in the spring, so I would often do a summer pruning just to make sure I could keep it in check and not have too many multiple branches. Because you can see in this middle picture, it wants to send up more and more and more of these multiple branches. Here's an example of what the spice bush looks like, and you can prune this one quite heavily as well, as mentioned. And then here's an example of the western redbud. This one I do prune both winter and summer if needed. The one on the left is before pruning, and then the middle is an example of taking a branch all the way back to the trunk when needed. And then the right is the same plant after it was opened up a little bit, just to give it some more air, to give the plants around it some more light, and just kind of reduce the feeling of density so that I could see through the plant, especially when I was trying to back a car out of the driveway. This is in my own yard. I found it, this opened it up and made it much easier to do that. And I think this one here was pruned about 2 years ago, and since then it's basically grown back, not only taller, but filled in a lot on the bottom, just like the original picture on the left. So I'll probably end up pruning this one back every 2 years. It doesn't seem to need it much more often than that. This is a plant that's not seen quite as much in gardens because it's very summer dormant, but it is gorgeous when it blooms in the spring, and it is a hummingbird magnet and makes a great plant for training along a narrow space as an espalier. Keep in mind it does have thorns, so it's can be a nice barrier plant when that is desired, but not a good plant to put next where people might brush against it. And it can be pruned in the late fall and even in the winter by removing out if there's extra canes and it's just too thick and you want to thin it out a little bit. You can go ahead and remove those all the way down to the ground, or partially remove if you're looking for a more branched structure. Sagebrush, this is our local sagebrush and Artemisia californica. It is okay to prune as long as you see these new little leaf buds, like in the middle picture here, starting to push out new growth. And you can prune down to one of those leaf buds, and then it will make a more filled in shrub. It's okay to leave the Artemisia californica and not prune it at all, as it might be left in nature. But if it starts to get a little bit leggy, a little bit too thin, you can cut it back. And like many plants, it's triggered to grow again when it starts to rain. So this one does its active growing in our area in February and March, sometimes even a little bit early. I have experimented with this one, as I have experimented with many plants and pruning, actually cutting it down a little bit more severely, and I've found it actually does come back. In some cases, I was actually trying to remove one and pruned it back, and then it came back from that sort of burl of branches in the middle. So it's quite resilient, I've found, once it's established. Other types of salvias that we have are more like the black sage or the Cleveland sage, and those can also be pruned in the summer, and the younger ones can be pruned back a little harder, and the older ones, when they get very woody, you would like to be very careful not to prune back too much into that hard wood, because sometimes they will not push new growth from that older wood. So here's an example of one that is quite young. On the left, you can see its flower stalks have shot way up and they've finished blooming entirely. And you can see my shears down there cutting off kind of down into the foliage. And then the one on the right is the finished pruned sage. And then when they get older, you'll kind of do that same thing, pruning down into the wood a little bit. And if you do prune right before the rains, you can sometimes prune a little bit further back into the plant, like take as much as half off of the plant, or maybe even up to 2/3 if you really want to pinch a sage back, as long as you're not going once again into that very old wood. This is an example of a little bit of a much bigger plant, more mature. This one's the purple sage, and the top one, you can see it's gotten quite large. It started to overgrow the path. And then the bottom one here is after pruning. So I took at least a half of that plant, a little bit more, probably more like 60% off of that one. And I did that in January on a dry day, and between kind of December rains and then later January rains. And it worked out very well, and it came back and pruned and bloomed quite profusely the next spring. And this species in general, you can kind of see by the picture on the left, it tends to put lots of little growth all down its stems. So it gives you lots of different places to cut it back, lots of different heights that you can cut it back to, which is really convenient. The Lupinus albifrons is another local native to our area, and it looks very, very showy in the spring. And then after these flowers finish blooming, it tends to dry up, and then can take a pruning way back. So below the level of the flowers, down into the foliage, and then it takes a rest during the summer and then starts to push new growth out again the next spring. Woolly blue curls is another plant that can be a great one for pruning in the summer to late summer, even into the fall. And you can see on the left, pruning back, the kind of the brownish area that's in the middle of that left-hand photo is the flower stalk that's finished blooming and has turned brown. And then I'm cutting not only past the brown area, but a little bit into those leaves where I can see the leaves are still green. And even though they're a little bit shriveled up and they're kind of going dormant, because that's what this plant wants to do, you can tell they're still living and they're going to grow back. So it gets pruned back into those little branches, and then the next spring it pops out with all this fresh new growth and looks very, very vibrant and flowers spring to late spring. And then once again, it takes a summer rest again. And it's really a good idea not to try to overwater these to prevent its summer rest, because you'll probably rot it if you do. So like a lot of the spring blooming natives, it needs a little bit of a break when it's not too moist. And so what I do with that from a design perspective is plant other things around it that are not as summer dormant, so that the garden doesn't look too dry in the summer, and that the things that want to be dry can go ahead and be dry, and they can be very showy in the spring but not look as dry in the summer, because those other things around it that are growing. And a good plant to pair with something that is going to be a little more summer dormant, like the blue curls, is the California buckwheat, because the California buckwheat is going to be flowering in the summer, all through the late summer and even into the fall. So it's July right now into August, and it's in full bloom right now. So it looks great to pair something that's robustly flowering and very showy with something that's taking a little bit of a dormant break. And this plant is also quite easy to prune. You can shear it back just about once a year after it's completely finished blooming, which is usually late fall, even into winter a little bit. And you can see the difference between the one on the left and the one in the middle, which has been nicely pruned just to kind of bring it into a more compact shape. And then it will grow back out and flower again the next summer. I get a lot of questions about Verbena lilacina because it's a little confusing to figure out how to prune this plant. When you prune it after it's kind of finished completely blooming, it starts to look very dry, and it looks dry and still really brown when you prune it. So the top portion there on the left is the unpruned, dry version. And then I pruned it in the middle here. I actually pruned this one a little bit early just to use for the pictures, because I wanted to be able to show folks what to do. When you first prune it, it's going to just have a lot of kind of dead foliage and some dead branches in the middle. And so what I'll typically do is I will give it a quick shear with my larger clippers. I'll just kind of shear the whole thing off just to kind of get the flowers off. And then I'll go in on this top middle picture with some small, sort of thinner, more delicate pruners, and I'll cut back to green leaves. So I'm kind of cutting off all those stubs, and I'm not going to see all those stubs. And then I'll go in and cut some of that dried foliage out. And that way it can still look green even when it's kind of taking its summer rest. And then the picture on the right, you can see the Verbena lilacina is the purple one down near the bottom right. And then this is actually a California lilac, or ceanothus, next to it. So you get this really fun pairing of blue and purple right next to each other, which is gorgeous in the spring. And they both stay green enough in the summer. I've found with a little bit more water and a tiny bit of shade, not dense shade, but just a very light dappled shade, sometimes the Verbena lilacina can bloom into summer, but usually it kind of finishes up right about the beginning of summer. Also a lot of questions about monkey flower, because monkey flower is a plant that looks absolutely fantastic when it's blooming in the spring, and it looks kind of leggy after that. It looks sometimes very dry. And so what we usually do for that one is just pinch it back with some tip pruning in the late summer or summer after it's finished blooming. And then that will give it a little bit more of a compact shape, and then it can grow out from that again and bloom next season. And I also tell people about the monkey flower. I try not to make this my focal point plant that is near the edge of an area, so that when it's not looking as good and has a little more dormancy, it's not as noticeable. Maybe it's kind of in the middle and you just kind of don't notice it as much when it's not looking that great. And then in the spring, when it is showy and flowery, you can see it and admire it sort of in the middle of areas. The coyote mint can be pruned back about 2/3 after blooming, and that's usually in the late summer. And on the left, you can see it's sort of finished blooming. There's still a few flowers that are in bloom there. Once that's kind of done and the birds have used those seeds, you will notice on this one quite specifically that it pushes lots of little new green leaf buds down along all the stems. And you can cut basically back into any of those leaf bud areas, and it will come back green with a little bit of water after it is pruned. Here is Artemisia David's Choice, the sandhill sage. And this one ends up looking very, very tidy after it's pruned. You just basically cut all off of those brown flower stalks down into the foliage to make sure there's no flower stalks sticking up. And then those make really nice compost, and you end up with this nice, tidy silver mound of a plant. It doesn't like too much hot sun, so keep it out of the sun in the baking hot afternoon. But other than that, it does quite nicely, and it makes a nice, great accent in the garden. The grandelias or gum plants are also unique because they do bloom in the summer, and you do not want to prune them back too hard in the summer. They will kind of continue to bloom along their stalks, and you can actually continue to prune back and let the flowers form. So they do benefit from some deadheading. They look a little bit better if the old flowers are deadheaded, but it will not stop them from blooming if you are busy and you do not deadhead them. And then after everything is completely finished blooming, that's when you'll cut it back, as in this middle picture here. It's usually almost winter, kind of like late fall to winter. I'm going to show a few other different types of buckwheats. These are the smaller buckwheats. And with these as well, you'll take that spent flower, that finished flower, all the way down into the green foliage, as you can see here on the left side. So you'll follow the stalk all the way down to where the leaves are and cut it off from there. The center picture here just shows what the stalks look like after they're cut off, and then you'll see it flowering again in the spring. And they tend to look pretty nice when the flower stalks are cut off. You still get some nice evergreen foliage. This particular one, Shasta Sulphur, in our area can get a little bit burned by the frost and can get almost kind of like some reds and browns in its foliage, which in most cases actually looks pretty good. In a really, really cold winter, it can start to not look as great, but it does rebound in the spring. And this one is the Grande variety rubescens. It is more of a coastal variety, but does quite well in our area. And this one tends to seed rather prolifically. So that is one thing to think about when you're strategizing pruning, is that if you let something go to seed, it will then spread its seed and more of it will propagate in plants that tend to come up from seed. So this is one of those, if you want to minimize its spread, you may do a little bit less, you may prune it a little bit earlier to not have as much seed broadcast. Eriogonum crocatum doesn't tend to seed for me as much in my garden. Neither does the yellow sulfur buckwheat, although I have seen it in other people's gardens. I rarely have it happen in mine. That could be because my garden's quite dry and I do very minimal watering. And it also could be gardens that are drip irrigated that just don't have a lot of water around them. Or maybe there's some species variation. But the nice thing about the saffron buckwheat is it looks really fantastic even in the winter. It keeps its very, very white-gray foliage, and that is a gorgeous contrast with other types of foliage in the garden. And it flowers in the spring, and as the flowers kind of go about their life, they turn kind of like an orange russet color, and that color is actually pretty attractive as well. And then when you prune it off, like in the middle photo, it looks very attractive. The California goldenrod is another one that we wait until the fall to trim back because it is a summer flowering plant. So it's a great plant to pair with other things that might be a little bit dormant in the summer and let it be very yellow and very showy and attract pollinators. And then those long stalks can be cut all the way to the ground in the fall. And this picture here on the upper right-hand side will show that there are still going to be leaves there after you trim off those long flower stalks. There are various types of native penstemons, and most of them have a similar type of pruning. You can cut off or deadhead their spent flowers through the summer, or you can wait until fall. You can also prune them back in late summer. They will be fine. This one in the middle, I actually just pruned about a week ago, and so it's not a problem to prune it this time of year in July or August. And basically the same thing as a lot of the other plants. trim down the stalk into the leaves a little bit to make sure there's no stubs of stalk showing up, and then let it rest. If it's very, very hot and it's in an exposed place, it may need some occasional summer water just to keep it green, and then it will come back and flower again the next spring. California fuchsias are another very interesting plant to prune because there are different types of California fuchsias and they have a little bit of different pruning style. So all of the low varieties that are the ground covers that are 12 or 18 inches high, those tend to be pruned all the way to the ground, and that time of pruning is usually at the very end of fall and in the winter. And they are heavily respond to the rain. So in the middle picture, you can see I actually would put my shears right at the base of the ground and be cutting those off all the way so they pretty much clean the whole slate. And then they come back almost immediately once it starts raining with the gray foliage and make a nice mound of gray foliage and then bloom again the next summer. Now there's other varieties that are tall. Those are the ones that are 4 and 5 feet tall. And by those pruning, I usually do those only about 2/3 back. And the reason is because they tend to form more of a woody base and they tend to respond a little bit better when they're not completely cut down to the ground. So those I will similarly wait until wintertime because they actually, for me, tend to bloom a little bit longer into the fall, and then cut them back to about by about 2/3, so they're 1/3 as tall as how they started, and then they will grow back in the winter once it starts to rain. Yarrow is also a plant that can be summer dormant or stay slightly green in the summer if it's given some water. So in our local hillsides, it will be totally brown this time of year in the summer. But you can use this plant as a lawn substitute and actually mow it, or you can use it as a perennial that's left to grow out and then trimmed back. Yarrow is another plant that will seed itself from its flowers. So it's a good idea to strategize. If you want to have more yarrow, you can let the seeds stay on, you can let the birds enjoy them. You can actually shake the seeds over the mulch or the soil where you want more yarrow to grow. Or you can take off those flower heads and collect the seed and plant it wherever else you'd like it to go. And if you don't want it to spread quite as much, you would trim it off a little bit earlier. So a few perennials that are okay to leave alone until fall and not prune would be the Lysingea, the goldenrod, the buckwheats, the grindelia, and the California fuchsia. And I did not show a picture of the Lysingea, the aster, California aster. It is a gray plant that kind of spreads along the ground, and it will bloom in the summer as well. So these are basically all plants that bloom in the summer, and you do not want to prune them too early. California poppy is a plant that has also some interesting things you can do with pruning. It will grow as a perennial if it is left, if its root is left in the ground. So what I usually do with my poppies is in May, right around the middle of May, when they finish blooming and they start to turn very brown, is I'll take my shears and actually just cut the plant off at the base, leaving the root in the ground. And then it will actually start to grow a new poppy plant. If it's watered, it may actually bloom again in the fall or late summer. If it's not watered, it will typically just stay there, and then the next winter when the rains start, it will grow from that root and continue to make a plant. You can also, of course, let poppies go to seed. Their little pods will break open and the seed will spread, and you will have poppies grow from those. So it's another plant that you can control how many more poppies you want by trimming them back or pulling them out before they put too much seed if you don't want as many poppies, or letting them all go to seed if you want more poppies. And the seed is very easy to save and reuse for the next season if you want to save it and then plant it someplace else. But I found that trimming them off at the base is a great way to manage the poppies. It keeps the dry fuel and the dry look at bay, but also lets you keep the plant where it used to grow. Our local irises are, and the hybrids of the irises, the Pacific Coast irises, are also kind of unique in how they're divided and pruned. So about every 4 to 6 years on average, sometimes a little more or less, you can dig them up and divide them. And they like to be divided in the winter. And they'll start growing from the base. You will see some reddish little new growth as shown here in this picture, and then you know they're about to grow. That's when you would dig them up, divide them, and then replant as needed. And they don't need to be divided. If you are going for a mass of lots of iris and you're enjoying how they're all filling in, there's no reason to divide them. It's really up to you if it's something that you want to do because the plant has gotten too large. But unlike the bearded irises, which are more of a summer plant for divisions, these are winter for divisions, and they don't tend to do very well if they are divided other times of the year. Other things you can dig up and divide would be the rushes or the reeds, the sedges, and the cool season grasses as well. Vine, like our California grape, is also a great plant that can be pruned quite honestly. Once it is established, it can be pruned any time of the year. But it's really nice to prune it in winter when the leaves are not on it because you can see the structure of its branches and you can prune to nice effect with the structure. And if you're trying to keep it growing like this on a trellis, quite honestly, you will probably need to prune it in summer and winter, if it's getting water especially, because they're pretty vigorous growers. And they do make grapes. They're edible. They have a seed in them, but they can be used for jams and jellies. And quite flexible with pruning. They come back and they're very hardy, so you can't go too wrong with pruning these. A couple different types of grasses and things to keep in mind with grasses. So there's two overall types. There's cool season grasses that grow in the cool season, and then there's warm season grasses that want to grow when it's warm or hot, as the case may be. And the cool season grasses, you would cut them back in the fall so that they can grow during when it starts to rain and the cool season. And those would include the fescues, Calamagrostis, the Melics, and several other types of species that grow in the cool season. And you can look up which ones are cool season if you have other varieties that you're not sure about. And then the warm season grasses are things like the deer grass, the blue grama grass. You would want to wait until spring to cut these back, usually like March, April, because if you cut them in the winter, they will sit there and they will not grow. They will just look unsightful for several months, especially deergrass. A lot of these grasses, they'll bloom and they'll actually keep their flowers over the winter and they still look really good. So it's a good idea not to cut those back too early, wait until later in spring. One thing that I learned about deergrass by talking to some of my maintenance colleagues is that you can actually rake out the dead foliage and it's much better than cutting it back. So this picture here on the right shows what it looked like after, the before on the left and then the after on the right. And it's not that attractive, even when done in spring. So a lot of people I've been talking with have had a really good luck just raking it out, and then it looks a little bit better. It still keeps its shape and its presence that way. So next topic is weeding, and I wanted to talk a little bit about different types of weeds and some strategies that I have for weeds. And one of the biggest strategies is to think about what you might do design-wise to minimize weeds. And so some of the lowest maintenance types of landscapes are individual shrubs with bark mulch in between and cardboard sheet mulch as part of that bark mulch, so that the landscape can easily be re-sheet mulched with more cardboard and more wood chips on top, and you can keep the weeds at bay over the years. As those things start to decompose and more weeds blow in, you can sort of re-defend by re-sheet mulching. So that's one of the lowest maintenance types of landscapes. The other things you can do are minimize watering during the summer and then use drip irrigation instead of spray irrigation, because that way you're not broadcasting water over the whole area and then there's less weeds likely to come up during the summer. And the highest maintenance types of landscapes for me, from my perspective, tend to be the meadows where you're trying to manage different types of little wildflowers that come over various seasons over a long stretch, or grasses and wildflowers mixed together, because that requires that you learn which things are weeds, which things are flowers, which things are grasses, so you know which things to pick out and which things to save. And one slight exception to this might be a meadow that is grown and then just mowed and then left to grow again. But that's not typical of most meadows. Most kind of have a longer season where you wouldn't necessarily just cut the whole thing back, especially if they are mixed species. If it's one species of just one type of grass, that could be a little bit lower maintenance because you could potentially just cut it all back in one fell swoop. And then you're only kind of figuring out what is the one species you have versus what are all the weeds. It's just harder to sheet mulch a meadow. It's there's always usually things that kind of blow into a landscape, even if we don't, even if we keep on our weeding, there's other things that want to come in. So a few common invasive weeds I'll cover by name and different strategies I have for those. The Bermuda grass, the oxalis, or the Bermuda buttercup, dandelions, spurge, euphorbia, and some of the annual grasses. And in our area, as I mentioned early in the talk, most of these annual weeds are most active in the late winter. So January, February, March, sometimes into April, and they're the result of rains spurring their growth. And secondarily, you can get weeds if you've disturbed soil. So anytime soil is disturbed or water, it tends to spur a flush of growth and seeds germinate or roots start to grow. The top strategies I have are hand pulling repeatedly to deplete the resources or remove the plant from the root, and then also sheet mulching, which I'll talk about. So this first one, fumitory, it's actually a little bit tricky because it looks like a poppy at first, but it is not a poppy. It has a little pink flower that comes up inside of it, and it is one to be pulled out right away by hand because it will spread its seed through those little flowers and more will come up. So this whole first batch of weeds is all the ones that I tend to hand pull, or I would lay cardboard and mulch on top for sheet mulching. The bittercress is the second one here. It's the one that when you touch the seed pods, they pop open and they spread seeds everywhere. So these are good ones to try to get out when you first see them so that they don't have chance to gain a foothold and spread more. The cleavers are also, those are the ones that are really sticky. When you try to pull them out, they stick to you, and they have a skinny little stem that goes into the ground where when you try to pull it, the stem and the roots stay there and then it will come back again. These are also better to hand pull if you can. To some extent, you can have success sheet mulching, but sometimes they will grow around the sheet mulch. And dandelions are also pretty successful sheet mulching, although they are so big that you can have better luck if you cut them down before you sheet mulch, because otherwise they have too much vegetation volume on them. And dandelions are actually edible, so you can eat them. You can eat them down. Other annual weeds are the euphorbias, the petty spurge and the spotted spurge and other types. They tend to seed themselves quite readily, and they come up by seed. So hand pulling those is effective, and sheet mulching those is quite effective. And I get them growing in between the cracks in my paving stones, and I use a little old knife to just sort of pick in there and get the root out. That's a pretty good strategy for me for removing them between the stones. Vetch is another one that has a little seed that stays in the ground often, so trying to pull it out and get that seed can be really useful. And then I showed this picture on the right because it is a situation where there is weed cloth that was positioned there, and then mulch was put on top, but that mulch blew away with the gardener who was doing blowing, and it certainly did not stop any of the weeds from coming in. This weed has been here before the mulch, while the mulch was there, after the mulch was there, and doesn't care about the weed cloth one bit. Plants do seem to find their way through cracks in the weed cloth. They tend to blow in on top of the mulch. As the mulch decomposes, which it naturally does, it makes soil above the weed cloth. And so the reason that I don't use weed fabric or weed cloth under mulch is many. The first is because it doesn't prevent the weeds in time. The second is because that decomposition zone where wood chips are naturally decomposing needs to happen so that they're decomposing into the soil, because that is actually what helps makes the soil very rich with microorganisms. It helps improve the soil structure. And when you have healthy soil, you can have healthy plants. So it's very important to let that decomposition process actually happen and seep into the soil. And the cardboard is what really helps us protect from weeds. And then, as mentioned, we can re-cardboard and re-sheet mulch over the years if we need to prevent weeds from coming in. There's a couple aggressive perennial weeds that are really frustrating for gardeners. Oxalis, or the Bermuda buttercup, is one of them. It's something that is often really gets a foothold in our properties in this area of Northern California, and can just start to really take over a garden. And my best strategy for this is to pull it repeatedly before it flowers, because you're going to deplete the energy of its bulb. It grows from a bulb that lies in some cases 12 inches or even 18 inches below the ground. They can be very deep. And as they make their little bulblets and they start to flower, they produce smaller little bulbs, so that when you pull them out, those little bulbs fall off or get separated, and then they make new plants. That's why it spreads more when you pull it out. So if you pull it before it has a chance to flower, it hasn't been able to put its energy yet into making those little new small bulbs. And you can just deplete it by continuing to pull the first couple seasons. So it's a lot of work the first couple seasons, but it pays off tremendously over time. And other strategies I've had success with this plant are double layers of cardboard or very thick sheet wood chips over the cardboard. And what that helps do is that by the time the bulb has grown up and the stalk and the plant have made their way through the cardboard, found a crack through the cardboard, come up through this thick mulch, and you pull it out, it's wasted a ton of energy trying to get itself above ground. And that loose layer of mulch makes it very easy to pull. So trying to pull this over compacted soil or thin compacted mulch is really hard, but pulling it out of really loose mulch is really easy and really quick. So it helps a ton to do thicker cardboard, double layers of cardboard, and thicker mulch. And then pulling it over the first couple of years especially. Bindweed is one I have to admit I still do not have a fantastic solution for. I have a battle with this in my own yard right now. The roots go super, super deep. I am trying to pull repeatedly, but it does not seem to be responding too much to that. It's still coming back. If you can do thick sheet mulch over this, I think it's probably a really good strategy. Same thing, like 2 layers of crisscrossing overlapping cardboard. This one is very problematic because it twines into the other plants. And then the other one that's kind of the other bane of my existence is Bermuda grass, because Bermuda grass also grows from underground stems that grow a long way, are quite vigorous, and if they're cut into pieces or fragments are left behind, those fragments will grow. So the one thing that you really do not want to do with this is to rototill, because you will think you've got it, but then you've actually just chopped up a whole bunch of pieces and created a whole bunch of opportunity for new plants to just start to grow. Things that I've had success with are sod cutting out, so actually cutting off a whole layer and then trying to do this in the summer because it's a warm season grower, letting it resprout and then cutting again, and then trying to make sure that I've basically pushed its growth and removed its growth and trying to remove every single root before I plant as much as possible, because it's very difficult to remove this plant from around other new plants that are desirable. So if you can do some repeated removal, make sure you've kind of eradicated it before you plant, you will save yourself a ton of work. And I had a full front yard of Bermuda grass and a full backyard of Bermuda grass, and it does eventually, you can eventually get rid of it. I am a person who really does not like to use chemicals, so I did not want to put Roundup or other products over it. I will say that if it grows underneath sidewalks, it is almost impossible to get rid of it without a tiny amount of spot spraying where it comes from underneath those surfaces, which is unfortunate, but it's the reality of what I had to do. I tried to do physical removal as much as possible and extremely minimal spot spraying only as needed. So here's an example of how to top off mulch with more sheet mulch if you have individual shrubs and you get weeds that come back in. So in this case, we had on the left side some shrubs filled in, some mulch, and this is actually in the summer, so you can't see the weeds. I've already cleaned them up at this point. It's a good idea to at least cut them down and get them a little bit lower to the ground before you sheet mulch, so you're not trying to put all that on top of that green vegetative growth. And then you can lay cardboard, you can lay, like in this case, I used old shopping bags. Make sure to take the level of the soil down a little bit toward the edge of the paving, about an inch or two lower, so that you're not piling up wood chips right next to the sidewalk or the paving. So take the soil level down a little bit, spread your surface of bags, cardboard, brown craft paper, anything that's biodegradable, that doesn't have a lot of toxic inks on it. We used to use newspaper, but when there were newspapers, but now that's not available. But boxes are great, and then overlap those. You can buy rolls of cardboard if you have a big space, so that you're doing less overlapping and you're getting more bandwidth from it. And then after that, put the wood chips on top, about 3 to 4 inches, and it'll also help maintain the soil moisture from too much cold, too much sun, and do it about every 2 to 3 years as needed for the types of plants and the open spaces you have. If your garden's totally filled in, you don't really need to do it as much. The good news is you can also plant into mulch. So if you've already sheet mulched and you're looking to put new plants in your garden, or if you've re-sheet mulched an area and then you want to add some plants, you can just push that mulch aside, either dig into the existing soil and kind of fluff it up, or add some new soil and then plant right into that. And the only real thing to be cautious of is any existing drip irrigation you have in the area, and to make sure you do not use only purchased pottings, planting type soil or compost, because that is just way too rich for native plants. So you want to use mostly the natural soil from the site, like 25% or less of new soil, if at all possible. If you absolutely need to buy more soil because you do not have enough, I recommend topsoil or something that is not super rich with too much growing medium in it. So I'd like to talk a little bit now about scheduling water and irrigation. Establishing new plants is very important because a plant that was grown in the nursery in its pot probably got water every day or every 2 days, and you're trying to transition that to a plant that needs water once every week or even less. So it needs a process to get its roots established. It can't be drought tolerant until its roots have formed a big network that allow it to pick up the water and nutrients it needs. And when establishing new plants, I like to recommend to water in the evening so that it soaks in when the soil is cool and the plant can use it the next day. And there are some sites that recommend morning watering as well before it gets hot. When you do water, soak the entire root ball perimeter, so the area that was part of the planted plant in the pot and the area all the way around it, and then gradually transition it over time to watering less often. When you check plants for moisture, a couple good things to do. Use your finger, poke it in the soil, see how it is on the top of the surface. Use what's called a moisture meter or moisture sensor, which is pictured here on this slide. It's a little device that you poke down in the soil and it gives you a red, green, or blue, dry, moist, or wet. You can get these from Ace or most other nurseries and garden stores. And they're a cheap, inexpensive device, so kind of use it with a grain of salt. They're not perfect, they're not precisely accurate, but they will definitely give you some indication. And sometimes even just poking it in the ground. If you cannot poke that thing in the ground because the soil is so dry and hard, that's a good indicator right there. One thing that happens is that plants, when they're in their nursery pot, are grown in usually a lightweight nursery mix that is not the same as our garden soils, which tend to be clay. And those plants can dry out and almost become hydrophobic, like they repel the water. So I have talked previously in my installation lecture about how to plant properly so that you're mixing the soils between the old and the new, and that doesn't happen to plants. And some hose watering is can't be understated. So it's important to note that you may have to do some hose watering as you're establishing your plants to supplement your drip system. Because the drip system is just not going to be as uniform as the rain or a hose would be. And that uniformity can be super beneficial because it really helps water move around appropriately sideways in the soil versus going straight down and not soaking the roots adequately. So especially at the beginning, that can be extremely helpful. If the weather's going to be very hot, it's important to water a couple days before it gets hot, not during the time that it's hot. So what makes a plant water efficient? It's adapted to local conditions. So it can get adapted to a summer dry situation because it has an extensive root system. It's also adapted with the microorganisms that exist in that soil. So soil bacteria, beneficial soil fungi, there's massive, large amounts of soil microorganisms that live in the soil that help the plant be healthy. And we want to make sure we feed those microorganisms by creating the situation for healthy soil. Plants can also be water efficient because they have small or gray leaves, and they can become water efficient because they take a summer dormancy and they're not absorbing as much water because they're conserving water by not having as big of a leaf during that time. So in general, how long do we want to water and how do we know? So what I first tell people is water by hose or drip and keep testing it until you can see that your plant is evenly moist. And that really helps you establish your water duration. You can do all sorts of different water scheduling types of techniques. You can look at what your flow of your irrigation is, how long to run it for based on various information that's online about how much water you want to apply. But then ultimately you do have to look out in your garden and see how that's actually being absorbed in various situations. Have you added more soil onto a berm that's lighter and it doesn't absorb as much water? Are you in heavy clay that absorbs water really quickly and holds onto it? So looking at those different kind of microclimate things. So you run your drip system based on what you think the schedule should be. Use a moisture meter to check for adequate saturation. And most importantly, avoid watering in small amounts. So instead, water deeply and less often. And so if you've got a drip system, it might be a 30 to 60 minute run time. If you have an emitter that's a flow rate of like a gallon per hour, and you've got a couple of those on a plant, you can run it for an hour, and you're not getting that many gallons per plant. You're getting in that 1 to 2 gallon range, which is probably perfect for that plant. So you'll adjust that run time depending on your emitter flow rate. The frequency, so when you're first establishing, you want to check them once or twice a week. If they're planted during the worm season, which is not ideal, check them more often. After the first winter, check about once every 1 to 2 weeks. And then after the second winter, their plants are going to be pretty established for the most part. And so you can back off at least a little bit more. And then you will start to water at that point based on what type of plant it is. Is it a California native chaparral plant? Is it more of a coastal plant that maybe needs a little more summer water? So you'll look at what type of plant it was, where it grows in nature, what it's adapted to, and your specific microclimate. Do you live a little closer to the ocean or the bay? Do you live at elevation? Are you in a rain shadow? What's your tolerance to some summer dormancy? Do you want the garden to stay a little less dormant? Do you want it to go totally dormant? So lots of questions you can ask and adjust accordingly. So after the first 2 summers, as mentioned, plants are pretty much considered established, and different types of plants are adapted for medium, low, or very low water, and some are adapted to high water, but we're not covering those here. So medium water, once it's established, you're going to water about once or twice per week. Low water is going to be about every 1 to 2 weeks. And a very low or no water is going to be about 3 to 4 weeks, or even less if it's a no summer water plant. Even with most of the natives that are totally low summer water, a little bit of a hose summer sprinkle can be okay. Tree of Life Nursery has some fantastic information about this on their website. And they basically explain how you can hose water a little bit just to cool the plant off, usually in the late evening or early morning during the cool times of the day, ideally during when we get a cooler patch of weather or maybe even some foggy days. You're not watering deeply enough to saturate the soil and cause root rot. You're just giving the plant a little bit of a cooling break. So how do we know whether our plant is low, medium, or high water? This is a fantastic resource called WUCLS, and you can go to this website and type in your zone, what city and county you're in, and then type in your plant name. And it will come back and it will tell you whether your plant is a high water plant, a medium water plant, and a low water plant. And I mentioned on here to remember the hydrozones because back in the first talk that I did about design, we talked about grouping plants with similar needs together, similar sun needs and similar watering needs. So ideally you would look them up and put all the medium plants together, water plants together on the zone, all the low water plants on a zone, etc. Because if you're trying to water one thing that wants medium water next to something that wants very low water, there's a conflict there. It's going to be really difficult to do with drip irrigation and just not even that happy with hose watering, to be honest. So group plants together that have similar water needs, and this is a great resource to help you do that. Smart irrigation controllers look at weather data and they adjust your watering system based on what is actually happening. There are a couple types. Some of them use historic data, which is not very useful because our weather varies a lot. We can have foggy July days and we can have 95 or 100 degree July days. So the best is a real-time weather station. There are many manufacturers, Rachio, Orbit, Hunter, Rainbird, all make different ones. Valley Water, our local water district, offers a rebate for these types of controllers. So you can check that out by looking up valleywater.org and looking up for rebates. And a lot of the smartphone ones, Hunter I'm pretty sure it's Hunter makes one, Rachio makes one, and you can basically have an app on your phone. You can schedule your water from wherever you are. You can check and make sure it watered. It's really fantastic, especially if you travel a lot. If you're not using a smart controller and you're using a standard controller that you have to go and turn the dial, and quite honestly, even if you are using a smart controller, you would want to check it at minimum each season. So 4 times a year, quarterly, fall, winter, spring, and summer. Even better is to adjust it monthly. And just at least check and see what it's doing and make sure that it's what you want. And you're going to adjust it because the days are longer and much hotter in the summer. Plants need the most water and in those times, and they need slightly less in spring. And even in fall, when they need a little bit less, it's still pretty hot here. So you want to make sure you're kind of keeping track of what the weather's doing and what the season's doing. And usually you turn off your controller from December to February when it's the wet season, unless we have an extremely drought year where there's 2 to 3 weeks or more with no rain. The reason is because for native plants, most all types, they do their active growing in the spring or summer. And that February, March time is very critical for them to get water, like January, February, March, because most of them are doing a lot of growing during that time period. And if they don't get water during that season, it does not set them up to be drought, sort of resilient in the summer. It's very common to add new plants among existing when you have an established garden and then you want to put in some new plants here and there, but it can be really tricky because you've got this mature plant that doesn't need water and then a new plant that does need water. So what I recommend is to establish new plants among existing during the cool season so that you're not going to have to do as much watering in the first place, and to use a hose water to establish those. So basically just use a hose and go ahead and soak it with the hose once a week. Because if you try to use your drip system and increase it to the frequency of the new plants, typically it's not, the old plants that are mature and established are not going to be very happy to be getting that excess water, especially during the spring, summer, and fall. So when you plant the new plants in among the old and you do it during the cool season, everything is more adapted to getting rain during that time because the soil is cool and they're actively growing. and you can kind of balance out their water needs a little bit better. And then it's less work for you during the hose watering, doing the hose watering for those new plants. So checking for leaks is a good thing to do. And also this is a way that you can check each of your zones to see how much gallons per minute they're using. And the way to do it is look at your water meter, open it up, turn on just one of your irrigation zones, assuming you have a drip zone or something similar. Watch the meter dial for 30 seconds. Record how many cubic feet the dial ticks. So most of those water meters have a dial that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, and each one of those numbers, 1 through 10, is a cubic foot. But you'll want to double check that that is indeed the measurement of your water meter. So you'd see how many numbers go after 30 seconds, and then multiply that by 2, so you know how many cubic feet you used in a minute. And then multiply that by 7.48, which converts that to a gallons per minute unit. And that is your gallons per minute per zone. And on most drip systems, you want to stay below 3 to 4 gallons per minute, because those little half-inch or 70-millimeter pipes can really only push through about that much water hydraulically. They're designed not to push through that much more than 4 gallons a minute. 3.5 or less is even better. And they work best, and the emitters all push out the right amount of water at that rate. So if you have more than that, you may consider splitting your yard up into separate irrigation zones. And it's also helpful just to know how many gallons per minute you have, because you can check for a leak that way. So if all of a sudden your system is flowing really, really high, then you know that you've got a puncture somewhere and water is coming out, which usually you can hear, but not always. So a couple things to think about for drip irrigation maintenance. It's usually very trouble-free in general, but you can clean the filter, like in this picture here, by just unscrewing the filter and taking that little piece out and then just rinsing it and putting it back in. You can open up the flush valve and flush it for a few minutes. Walk the system and listen for leaks. That's the most important thing, really, is each spring, turn it on, see if you hear any leaks, and then just keep an eye on plants to make sure they all seem like they're healthy enough and getting water. In the month, the summer monthly tasks, usually once a month, I read my water bill and just make sure I don't have any big use surprises there. And then, if I haven't already, it's another good time to just double check that I'm not getting any leaks, so I'm not using more water than I need to be. So I'm going to wrap it up by just talking about a few of my favorite tools. And I'm a very small person, so I tend to use things that help me out as a smaller person who's not super strong. In general, I like to use things that don't require a bunch of energy. So I like to use my own physical energy, which not only saves a lot of electricity, but gives me some exercise if at all possible. One thing about electricity and water is they're very tied together. So our electricity accounts for a lot of our freshwater use. We use a lot of water. We use electricity to move water around in our state. And so we're using one, we're basically using the other. It also takes 18 gallons of water to produce a gallon of gas. So as we use gas, we're also using water. So a few of the things that I like to use that are hand tools are brooms and rakes. I love to push the leaves up with a broom, rake them up with a rake, put them in my yard waste bin, put them in my compost, use them for cover on the soil, because most trees really benefit from having a cover of leaves. That's one of the reasons they shed their leaves, is so that they can make a nice forest environment for themselves. So first of all, try not to obsessively clean up too many leaves. I tidy them off of paved surfaces. I tidy them off of plants so that they don't cover plants, but I try not to clean up every single leaf. And when I do need a power tool, I tend to go with electric power tools. There's some really nice little small mini blowers. Makita makes a nice one right now. It's super small, but it's really powerful, and it's variable speed, and I love that one. And you can also use a leaf vacuum if you want to, and then you have a bag of leaves that you can put on your compost or reposition someplace else and feed the soil. With pruning tools, I usually use a pair of hand pruners. I use a serrated pruning saw, And then one of my favorite things are these bypass power loppers. These are designed to have a unique angle to them so that they actually give you more power for each lopping that you do. And someone asked me what brand I use. The one I like is by Fiskars. And they're really fantastic. You can cut like 1.5 inches or so branch, maybe even a couple inches on a softer wooded tree quite easily, and keep them sharpened with a sharpening tool. But in general, you can see I use pruning tools that favor individual pruning. I'm not hedging or shearing or using power shearing tools or big hedging shears. I want things to have more of a natural shape. For weeding tools, I use a weeding fork. I use a weed knife or a hori-hori knife, and I often use a kneeling pad to protect my knees as I'm doing my weeding. The weed knife is fantastic because it has a serrated section you can use to cut off plants. It has a pointy end you can use to dig up weeds. And it also serves as a shovel if you need a shovel at the same time. And then I should have put on here my little mini knife. Like I get inexpensive little paring knives, and I use those to pull weeds out of sidewalks and things. So I will wrap up today with just showing two examples here of some low maintenance gardens, just to leave us with some inspiration. This one is a mix of low shrubs and a few small trees. And then this is another one that my former colleague Sherry Osaka designed, and before she passed away, a really nice one with some Ceanothus Yankee Point and a nice red bud in there, very low maintenance, yet very attractive, a nice and simple front yard. A couple resources I would like to share are valleywater.org. This is a great place to go for information on rebates. There's a rebate for converting your lawn to low water plants. There's a rebate for irrigation equipment and smart controllers. They also have some design assistance programs, some water audit programs. So it's a fantastic starting point. And then a couple resources that I'm listing here for watering. One of them is the Tree of Life nursery. Both of these are CNPS resources, but the other one that's not listed here is the Tree of Life nursery. These CNPS resources both talk about different ways to water native plants if you want more detail on that. And then I wanted to leave you with 2 irrigation scheduling apps. Both of these are designed by noted irrigation designer Lori Palmquist. She is a champion of scheduling water. If you are really interested in advanced water scheduling and design of our inline drip systems, she offers classes and they are fantastic. And I talk a little bit about inline drip in my second talk about installation. But she has these 2 great schedulers. One is for point source, the type of irrigation that's a tube with emitters punched in. And then one is for inline drip, which is the type of tube that is basically has a long stretch of tube with emitters automatically built in it that makes a grid. So I would like to thank again the Cupertino Library and Priya for supporting this talk, as well as all the volunteers here today. And I really appreciate being able to share what I know. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie.